Okay, class, here's yet another lecture to bore you with about V. And just want to, it's kind of hard to do, a comic, this big. Normally we had class and, I'd spend, a couple months on Alan Moore and, but we don't have some of that time. And normally I would kind of flip through, go through the comic book in order and discuss some of these, try to cover everything, but, we're just not going to be able to do that kind of in this format. So let me tell you a few of the things to look for. Of course, there's all kinds of literary references throughout this thing and artistic references. You can see the value, like I said in the previous lecture about Nietzsche and art and Vivu and the Übermensch. You can see the kind of values that V places on the arts and how it informs, his reality. I mean, and there's only like 6 or 7 or 16 songs that are legal in this New England, and they're all like, military marching songs, so we actually get to see music through him. Fun fact, Alan Moore is actually a musician, and he's actually been in a few bands and had a few albums, and he and another guy who's a pretty famous English musician did an entire album just for this comic book. It's like got a soundtrack. And that song in the middle of it with the music is actually, one of the songs from the album. And you can find it on YouTube if you're interested. Okay, so one of the main things that I wanted to talk about. If you'll notice, this book is in 3 parts. In the beginning of at these 3 parts, you see dominoes being set up, and then the final one, it's knocked over. And again, it's that Nietzsche idea of predestination. Everything we do is already predetermined. So it's like, V is subject to this fate because, he was created through this experimentation. If you notice, this New England, was born out of the fires of nuclear war and climate change. V was born out of the fires of, this explosion that he created when he was at Lark Hill. Evie is reborn in water through the rain scene. And that's interesting because, anarchy destroys things like fire does. It's kind of like the forest, through the natural life cycle of forest, things burn down. And then rain, provides that new life and that new growth. And that's what you have in V and Evie. And, and Evie becomes V. So, one of the things, that you're going to want to look for is, symbolically the way that the main villains die. Like Prothero kind of used people as playthings, as objects to experiment on. He becomes a doll. The preacher, himself, he ends up dying, at the hands of, kind of proving, that his God is not real, or at least his God is not on his side when V gives him a poison wafer. That's an interesting thing. That's an interesting little scene because of the idea of transmutation. The idea that, when we take the bread in communion, it's supposed to transform when it goes into our body as the body of Christ, and the wine is supposed to transform into the blood. And he gives the preacher a poison wafer and is like, well, if your God's so real and your belief is so real, then, transmute this poison in the, soul nourishing, body of Christ. And of course he's unable to do it. We also see Miss Hire, for instance, who tries to manipulate people. She ends up, she tries to manipulate and control people. At the end, she ends up being manipulated and controlled. Essentially, a group of bums end up kind of raping her and having sex with her in order for her to survive. Basically all the main people, if one's a predator on other people, he ends up getting, predated upon, like the main fingerman. So characters who make other people, act as prostitutes, or use them that way, they end up having to prostitute themselves. There's so many elements in this. It's so complex. It's just really awesome. Really awesome. So, another thing that you really want to look at is how, this whole thing between Adam, Susan, and V. Essentially Adam Susan is married to Fate, and you have this whole kind of thing between he and V talking about, having sex with each other's wives or girlfriends or mistresses. And we're talking about like Lady Justice and Lady Anarchy and the computer Fate. And you find out, of course, at the end of the comic that V has stolen Fate, kind of made Adam Susan a cuckold, so to speak, by taking Fate and being in control of that computer system and that predictive capability. And that's how he's able to plan all this stuff and do all these things, because he's made his own Fate and had access to it the entire time, which causes Adam Susan to pretty much crack and go insane. But Adam Susan had first had an affair, with V and the people's mistress or lover, which was Lady Justice. And V cheats on Lady Justice because she cheated on him with, Adam Susan, so to speak, with Anarchy, and that's his mistress who he's fallen in love with. So, these are really interesting concepts to look at. Another concept that you want to look at is the idea of predation. And essentially, sorry guys, I'm getting a cold. I apologize for coughing. Essentially, characters are constantly, predating upon each other. They're, like a wolf and a rabbit. So that's going to be, kind of one of the major concepts. And, the people are predated upon by the powerful. I think you really kind of see the viciousness of it in the cabaret, the bar, where of course it's completely hypocritical. All the things that are illegal, like booze and drugs and prostitution, are available to all the rich and powerful. And, you get to see that essentially where one person points out the failings of this new government system and the hypocrisy of the situation, and then everybody in this bar, all the men in this bar just kind of beat this guy to death in front of everybody, and it really shows the savagery. You also have the kind of the vaudeville, the theater of the absurd, this that you might want to look into. This kind of a British concept that shows up in this comic book, and if you're not familiar with that, it'd probably take me too long to explain it. You'd have to do a little research, but it's essentially the theater of the absurd. It was like these kind of variety shows where all kinds of different things happen, and you see V kind of play on that a little bit when he kills Prothero. One other thing you really want to look at starts on page 113, and it's essentially a speech that V gives the people. It starts on 112 when he takes over the TV system. And that's a really interesting speech because he defines, his expectations of people and how we keep failing them. And he challenges the people to say, essentially he uses this metaphor of us working for a corporation and how we're all going to get fired. But it's a pretty interesting monologue to look at because it goes into all types of philosophies, essentially about how we have the opportunity here on earth to create paradise, but we constantly squander it because we keep giving our power over, to these people. And that's where Hobbes comes in.